All right, welcome everyone. I'm Tina Panic from the Avon Library, here with Jen Bennett from the Senior Center, Terry Wilson from the Historical Society. You're here for our fourth lecture in our Connecticut Paleo-Indian series. Tonight we will be in webinar mode, so you will be able to see and hear all of our presenters and speakers, but we will not be able to see and hear you. Please use the chat box or the Q&A if you have any questions. We do have live transcript forming at the bottom of the screen for those who would benefit from that. We are recording this event, and then we will send the recording out to everyone who registered, as well as post it on our YouTube channel for people to view. As I said, this is the fourth in 5 events, and I'm going to turn it over to Terry Wilson from the Historical Society to fill you in on the things we have coming, and also to introduce our guests tonight.
Thank you, Tina. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Historical Society Library and Senior Center and our planning committee for this Unearthing History series, I welcome you to the fourth educational and informative event in this series. We thank the Farmington Bank Community Foundation for a grant to make this possible. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. And for our regulars, welcome back. As some of you may know, the discovery of the Brian Jones Paleo-Indian site along the Farmington River in Avon happened in early 2019. In February of 2020, we held the first public presentation about it at the Avon Senior Center. Because of so many questions by the audience about this time period of 12,500 years ago, we created these presentations to help explain this continent, as well as give updates as they're available on the Avon site named for the late state archaeologist Brian Jones. So tonight we're pleased to have with us Dr. Lucianne Lavin, who can help answer for us a question asked of us many times since that first event in February 2020. Who were the early people of this area of North America that eventually became Connecticut? Dr. Lavin is Director of Research and Collections at the Institute for American Indian Studies, a museum, research, and educational center in Washington, Connecticut. She's an anthropologist and archaeologist who has over 40 years of research and field experience and is a founding member of the state's Native American Heritage Advisory Council and a retired editor of the Journal of the Archaeological Society of Connecticut, a position she held for 30 years. She received her master's and PhD in anthropology from New York University and her bachelor's from Indiana University. Among many awards she has won over the years, her most recently won was a Certificate of Award for Women in American History from the National Society of the Daughters of the American Revolution. Dr. Lavin has written over 200 professional publications and technical reports on the archaeology and ethnohistory of the Northeast, including the one here, which is the focus of tonight's talk. This is the book that I've read. I'm considering it the Bible of Connecticut's Indigenous people. Her latest book, Dutch and Indigenous Communities in 17th Century Northeastern North America, is an edited volume rated by Book Authority as one of the 16 best new archaeology books to read in 2021. She's a resident of Torrington, Connecticut. Dr. Lavin, I'm going to turn the event over to you.
Thank you very much, Terry. Oh, I only have one request for
Tina?
whoever is, yeah, Tina, please. That the middle of my screen has that this meeting is being recorded, and you're going to have to move it so I can read the slides.
I think if you click out elsewhere on your screen, the message will go away.
Are you sure? I'm afraid because it says leave meeting on it. So I don't want anything to happen. It says continue and it says leave meeting. Which one shall I hit?
Continue.
I don't hit leave
Continue,
meeting.
yeah.
Maybe continue. There we go. Okay, thank you. And thank you everyone for attending this meeting. What I'm going to do basically is to give an overview of all of the cultural periods in Connecticut Native American history. Hopefully, so you will get an idea of where Paleo-Indian period sits and what happens afterwards. Now, this particular topic, I could give a 2-semester course on it. So I am only going to briefly touch on major events that characterize each of these cultures. And please believe me when I tell you that there's many more discussions that we could have on this, and read my book, and that way you'll find out. So go ahead, Tina, next slide. Okay. I want to step back a little bit and just talk about 4 major characteristics of Native people, Native communities in Connecticut, actually in New England, and probably Native communities everywhere, because there's a lot of stereotypes that are still being believed by the general public. And so these 4 characteristics, it's crucial that if you take anything away from this talk, to take this one slide away with you. Native peoples have been here a very long time. And as if you saw the first presentation in this series by Sarah Sportman and David Leslie talking about the Brian D. Jones site, you know that it is now the oldest site, the oldest known site in Connecticut at 12,500. There are probably many other sites in Connecticut that actually are even earlier than that we haven't found yet. But they've been here a long time, and they've been here continually. They didn't all die off or go west or marry into white society, and now we only have casino Indians. That is not true. We do have Indians who own casinos, but they are definitely Native American peoples. And so we know that they've been here continually because archaeology shows us that. We have archaeology sites dating from Paleo-Indian right up into the modern period. Also, these Native communities were never simple, never primitive, never childlike. These are very complex communities dating right back to the Paleo-Indian communities, with complex technologies, complex economies, complex spiritual life, and a very sophisticated belief system. And it's very important that you realize that, because if you realize that, then you'll realize the importance of these societies to our general American history and American culture. Okay, next slide. All right, this is a cultural chronology of Native American history in Connecticut that I actually just created a couple of days ago. And it basically shows you that there are 4 major stages in this history, comprising 10 periods, beginning with the Paleo-Indian period, which is the earliest known period in Connecticut, dating to, you'll notice there's a question mark there because even though we now know that it's dated to at least 12,500 years ago, it may go back many thousands of years before that, and I will get into that when we get to the Paleo-Indian slide. There's the Archaic stage with 4 periods: early Archaic, middle Archaic, late Archaic, and terminal Archaic. And these are identified by specific artifact traditions, often based mainly on what are called projectile point types. Projectile points are the tips of spears, atlatls, arrows, and sometimes we don't know what those points were used for, so we call them projectile points. And also a lot of those points you will see on the screen when I show you, a lot of them, by the look of them, they were actually, and by their use wear, they were actually used as knives. Probably many of them were actually women's tools as opposed to men's spear points and arrowheads. They were probably used by women as knives in food processing. Okay, and you can see that the Archaic stage starts at about 9,000 years ago and ends about 2,700. That's when the Woodland stage starts with a whole bunch of of more characteristic material culture. And there's, again, 4 periods: early, middle, late, and final woodland. And the final woodland, actually, you can see that there's some fairly strange dates there, 426 to 317. And that's because they, I've put them at those dates because they signal important events that happen in specific years. AD 1524, when Giovanni di Verrazzano sailed into New York Bay and then sailed over to Narragansett Bay. And he is the first known European visitation to New England and New York. And then 1633 is the year when Europeans first created settlements in Connecticut. The Dutch actually created a settlement in what is now known as Hartford when they put up the House of Good Hope, which was a trading post and a bowery. And bowery is the Dutch term for farmstead. There were actually Dutch settlers there as well as traders. And also in that same year, the English put up a settlement at Windsor. And that signaled the post-European settlement period, often called the contact period. And that takes us from AD 1633 right up to the present. Now, I should also add that if you look at other books on Connecticut history or New England history, you look at 5 different books, including mine, and you'll probably see 5 different year ranges there, because these ranges are based on cultural events that occurred, and some of those cultural events were gradual. So you will have different dates, and also some of those cultural events occurred at different times in different geographic regions. Also, my dates also signify physical events that occurred as well. And also some researchers use different events to begin and end different periods. Okay, back at, go ahead, Tina. Good. Paleo-Indian period. Now, most of you know that Connecticut was covered by the Wisconsin Glacier for thousands of years. And this glacier is estimated by geologists in some places to have been over a mile high. And it wasn't until around 17,500 years ago that southeastern Connecticut was ice-free, while the rest of Connecticut was not. By 13,500 years ago, all of Connecticut was ice-free, and it was covered by a tundra environment, which is basically a grassland environment with a few trees here and there, coniferous trees, spruce. Let's see, what else? Oh, yes. And of course, this is the Brian D. Jones site, was dated to 12,500 years ago. Now, there are much older sites, as I said before, probably located south of the glacier on the Atlantic shelf. Because the glacier was so large, where did all that water come from? Well, it came from the Atlantic Ocean. And so the Atlantic Ocean fell several hundred feet during this Paleo-Indian period. It was much of what is covered now by the Atlantic was dry land. And in fact, there was no Long Island Sound. Long Island was, that Long Island Sound area was actually dry land with a large freshwater lake in it. If you're from Connecticut, you call the lake Lake Connecticut. If you're from New York, you call it Glacial Lake Flushing, but it's the same lake. Anyway, that lake was there, and then Long Island was attached to the Connecticut mainland and extended 60 miles, 60 miles onto the Atlantic shelf. All that was dry land. And local oral traditions by native peoples in the area, especially the Narragansett, but others as well, these traditions claim that their ancestral communities were actually located south of the glacier. And south of the glacier means the present Atlantic shelf, though, which is now inundated with water. And I know that Dr. Kevin McBride and Yukon and Mashantucket Pequot Museum had been doing underwater archaeology studies in those areas and have found a number of natural features that would be very conducive to Native American settlement in those areas. For example, Long Island Sound has underwater submerged rivers and hillsides and terraces where we know that Native American communities like to set up camps. So that's probably where these very early sites are located. And we know the reason we think there's very early sites much earlier than 12,500 is because in many of the non-glaciated portions of the United States, there are radiocarbon dates from Paleo-Indian sites that range, or even, it may even be pre-Paleo-Indian, that date from 25,000 to 50,000 years ago. One example is Pandeo Cave, which is located in Oro Grande, New Mexico. And this cave had a very early archaeological site. The lowest levels dated from, there were 5 radiocarbon dates from these lowest levels, and they dated from 26,000 to 36,000 years ago. And not only did we have these early dates, but we actually had evidence of human occupation there, because there were tools, including an object that was probably a wedge that was stuck into one of the bones there, one of the faunal remains from extinct horse. There were also cultural features, which are non-portable artifacts, such as hearths, cooking hearths. And these were clay lined, and one of them actually had a human palm print in them. So there's definite evidence that, yes, there was a Native American community living in this cave 26 to 36,000 years ago. Now, let's see. So I guess the takeaway for the key characteristics on this is that Paleo-Indian communities were relatively small, mobile communities that were performing large-scale annual migrations. I am not a Paleo-Indian specialist, but those archaeologists who are believe that they were performing these large-scale migrations because they were following the caribou. That was their main food source at this time period. And the caribou, of course, make these very long-range summer-winter movements. And there are some archaeologists that believe that in southern New England, Native people were, of course, wintering in southern New England and moving up to northern New England during the summers following the caribou. Others have suggested that they have gone as far as from southern New England up to upstate New York and the Great Lakes, or down to the Delaware watershed. But in any case, they are definitely very migratory peoples. Okay, next slide. Can we go back to the last slide? I forgot to talk about this photograph. This is a photograph from the files from the Institute of American Indian Studies Museum. And it shows excavation at the Templeton site. And the Templeton site was considered the oldest site in southern New England for many years before the Brian D. Jones site was discovered in 2019. And this photograph shows a crew from the museum under the direction of Dr. Roger Moeller, who was the locator and the director of this site. And the really interesting part of it, well, there's a lot of interesting things from the Templeton site, but there was some environmental data that Moeller had recovered that showed that originally it was thought that Paleo-Indians were living in spruce forests, but this is a late Paleo-Indian site, and it shows that it was actually a vegetal mosaic on the landscape, because not only did they find evidence of coniferous trees, but also oak. Now, recently, Dr. Zachary Singer has gone back. These excavations here were done in the early 1980s. And Roger actually wrote a book on this site called 6LF21. Now, recently, Dr. Zachary Singer has gone back to this site and for the last few years has done excavations there. And I'm sure that is probably one of the things he will be talking about with David Leslie in the October lecture of this series. Okay, next slide. These are some of the artifacts from the Templeton site. You can see there is the characteristic fluted point on your left, and it's called a fluted point because there are these large flakes taken, well, one large flake on each side taken from this point, and you can see that. I don't think my pointer will my pointer work on this, Tina? Can anybody see this where I'm actually doing?
No, I don't think it's going to show up.
I don't think so. But anyway, it's probably for hafting purposes, but that's why they're called fluted points. And they're very characteristic of the Paleo-Indian period. On the right, the lower three artifacts are gravers. You can see they've got these little sharp points at the end. Those are used for engraving bone and antler. And the top two are miniature points. They're very rare. They're found at a few Paleo-Indian points, Paleo-Indian sites in the eastern United States, at least. We don't know what they're for. They could have been, some suggestions are that they were made by children apprentices. Another idea is that they're actually magical artifacts for hunting magic. Next. Next slide, please. Yes. Okay, now we're into the early Archaic, which lasted 1,000 years, from approximately 9,000 to 8,000 years ago. And this is extreme climatic change here, a very strong warming climate. Researchers, geologists have suggested, actually estimated that the July temperatures were 8% higher than the July temperatures that we actually experience today. And so you see a decline in the conifers, the spruce conifers, and you see an appearance of mixed pine and deciduous forests, birch and oak particularly. The caribou have left because they don't like this type of environment. They much prefer cold spruce forests and tundra. So they leave and they are replaced by a great diversity of plant and animal life, because the deciduous forests, the deciduous woodlands can support a great number of animal and plant life. Also, because you have this very warming climate, the polar ice caps are melting rapidly. And so you see quickly rising sea levels. And what this does for Connecticut is it, of course, it inundates that freshwater lake Lake Connecticut, Lake Flushing, and forms Long Island Sound. And of course, this opens up the Connecticut coast, and for Native people living in those areas are now able to exploit the saltwater food sources. And now these new environments cause great changes in economic and social behavior. They also show a dip in population and in the number of sites relative to the Paleo-Indian period. And what I'm saying is there were more sites and more people on the landscape during the Paleo-Indian period than there were during the early Archaic. Now, this may be a factor of their attempts to cope with these very different environments. It also may be a factor that Paleo-Indian peoples have moved with the caribou. Many of them moved with the caribou northward. And so there are empty spaces here for people to move in. And we do see that there's at least one group that has of southern roots based on the artifact assemblage. There is a focus here on the upland wetlands, the large swamps, fens, even lakes in the uplands. This is where the reason is because this is where most of the plant foods and animal foods are located. The cultural remains suggest that the seeds of cultural diversity are starting now. We're seeing different cultures on the landscape. We're actually seeing two different populations here, at least two. And we're also seeing what I call community regionalism is basically these people are starting to learn how to use the local landscapes. They are staying in one place. They aren't going from southern New England up to northern New England. They're staying in the greater Connecticut area and learning about their regional physical environments, learning about how to live in them, to how to cope with them. We're also starting to see seasonal settlement systems. And this is the beginning of what's called the seasonal subsistence cycle or seasonal round that is so characteristic of later periods. This is where people stay in one region and they move from base camp to base camp around this region, following the seasonal, exploiting seasonally available food sources at each of those camps. Okay, next slide. So there are two basic artifact traditions. One is called the Atlantic Slope tradition. The other one is called the Gulf of Maine tradition. And it is believed that these, at least by many researchers, that these two artifact traditions actually represent two separate populations, human populations on the landscape. Now, an example of the Atlantic Slope tradition is the Dill Farm site. The Dill Farm site is located on a large swamp in the uplands of East Haddam. It has a radiocarbon date of 8,560 years ago. And located within this site were food remains, basically nut fragments, hazelnuts and walnuts, which suggest a seasonal site that people were occupying the site from late summer to early fall. There was also a cache of crystal quartz stone quarry blocks that were found in an underground storage feature. In other words, they were stored in an underground pit. And the quartz quarry blocks are actually the raw materials used for making stone tools. And the fact that they were cached suggests that these people expected to come back again. In other words, there's repeated occupation. You see the beginnings of repeated occupation at specific sites. And Dill Farm, and they, in fact, they do come back, not only repeated occupation during the early Archaic, but there is also a major Middle Archaic component at Dill Farm too. So you see, it's basically interpreted by its excavators, which was Dr. John Pfeiffer, as a short-term camp that was repeatedly occupied by early Archaic people. And one of the major styles of this Atlantic slope tradition, point styles, is the bifurcated base point. This is Kanawha that you see right here, these three on our right. And they have, if you notice on their base, they've been chipped. So there's that concavity, and that's what's called a bifurcated base. And a lot of these Kanawha points and other material, other tool types from these sites, these Atlantic slope types, are representative of southeastern point types that are found along the Carolinas and Virginia and the mid-Atlantic. And they're dated earlier than the sites we have up here in New England. Also, a lot of exotic tool stone were used to produce these artifacts. Some from the southward, for example, the lowest point here is made out of jasper. A lot of it's Pennsylvania jasper coming from the mid-Atlantic. But we also, and argillites also from the mid-Atlantic, but we also have some of these tools are rhyolites and felsites from northern New England, the Boston Basin. So you definitely see the trade routes are beginning to evolve here. It's not, it could be also some population movements coming in from those areas. And I would think that it's probably both population movements, combination of population movements and trade networks. Next slide, please. This is the Gulf of Maine tradition, exemplified by the Sandy Hill site. The Sandy Hill site is located near the Great Cedar Swamp at Mashantucket. And Mashantucket is in the southeastern portion of the state. As I said, it's part of the sovereign nation of the Mashantucket Pequot. Radiocarbon dates from this site date from 9340 years ago to 8470 years ago. Site was excavated by under the direction of Dr. Kevin McBride, who was director of research at the Mashantucket Pequot Museum. And the photographs here are courtesy of Dr. McBride. And it differentiates, the Gulf of Maine tradition differentiates from the Atlantic slope tradition by the fact that there are very few bifacially made artifacts. Bifacial artifacts are artifacts that are chipped on both sides, such as those Kanawha points I showed you. Unifacial artifacts are just chipped on one side. For example, unifacial scrapers, and a number of other chipstone tools. They also had a number of small quartz, mostly quartz cores, that might have been used to make micro tools for processing plant materials. That was interpreted by Dr. Brian Jones, had suggested that interpretation, who also worked on the site. And for anybody who doesn't know, Dr. Jones was the former state archaeologist before he recently and unexpectedly passed away. They also found large choppers which the excavators believed were used as hand spades for digging up tubers. And the artifact up there in the upper right-hand corner is one of those large Nice choppers. And you can see it's a pretty good sized chopper. That scale there in centimeters, that's 12 centimeters scale, which is about 5 inches. So that's a good size tool. In fact, one of those choppers actually had, I think it was phytolith remains on them that suggested that it was used for digging up nutsedge tubers. And there are evidence of a great number of plant remains used in these sites. And I'll talk about it when I talk about the house remains. But also there were groundstone tools showing up. Groundstone gouge and a groundstone adze, which suggests woodworking, heavy duty woodworking. A really exciting find at this site were semi-subterranean pit houses. And the lower photograph shows one there. They were dug into a southward facing slope at Mashantucket. And that light semicircular plan that you see there shows part of one of those pit houses. The dark circles represent the remains of the large wooden post holes, posts that were, those are post molds that you see. Those are the remains of the large posts that held up the house. And when the posts, of course, rot, they leave those large dark circles there. And these houses, the floors, contain a great deal of dietary remains, both plant and animal remains. Most of the bones were small mammals, but there was a great variety of plant species, from seedy plants like chenopode and amaranth to nuts to tubers, bulrush, cattail, blue flag, nutsedge, what else? Arrowroot, I think, and there were a number of others too. And by the way, chenopodia are very important. There's the seeds, these seedy plants. You probably know them as goosefoot or lamb's quarters. And if you have vegetable gardens, you see one of these and they're the bane of gardeners, because one plant contains thousands of seeds. And if it goes to seed before you find it in your garden, you're going to have a zillion plants, which we call weeds, next summer. But they were extremely important to Native people, and they are found in every cultural period, in sites from every cultural period, from early Archaic all the way up into the 16 and 1700s, because they're extremely nutritious. They're very high in vitamin C and fiber and have a whole bunch of minerals and other vitamins as well. And they were put in soups and stews to thicken them. They were also ground into a meal and to make unleavened breads and cakes out of them as well. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and now we are into the Middle Archaic, 8,000 to 6,000 years ago. And this is a very hot and dry period. The warming from the early Archaic continues, and so does the drying. So much so that a lot of the smaller wetlands actually disappeared during this period. And the large wetlands and river valleys also shrink. Other evidence of this hot, dry period is the presence of American holly in some sites. This is not a local Connecticut plant. It's a southern plant. Also, geologists have found charcoal granules in their in soil cores off-site. So these charcoal granules are not evidence of cooking. These are off the archaeological sites. These are actually evidence of forest fires. Also, hickory makes its appearance on the landscape, and hickory is a very drought-resistant tree. All evidence of, and also there's an increase in grass too as well. So all evidence of hotter and drier climates here. And again, there is a change in the settlement pattern where you see a movement from the uplands and smaller wetlands down into the major river valleys. But you also see them continuing to live in the large interior wetland areas as well. But definitely a lot of these sites are along the major river valleys, very different from earlier, when the river valleys were not that conducive to living there, because the rivers were moving very fast, they were very cold, and there weren't that many, that much plant life in these valleys in the earlier Paleo-Indian and early Archaic periods. But people are coping with these environments, and we see an increase in sites. In fact, the early, I think I forgot to say that, during the, no, I did say that, didn't I? The early Archaic, there's actually a decrease in sites from Paleo-Indian period. Well, now we see a site increase. The number of sites increase, the number of artifacts on these sites increased, and the number of functional sites increase. And by the way, these increases in sites and artifacts and functional types continue to increase all the way into and during the late woodland period. And then again, there is increasing evidence of seasonal camps, of this annual seasonal subsistence round is definitely evident during the Middle Archaic period. They are definitely doing a seasonal round and becoming even more regionally involved, where the communities are definitely starting to settle into regions here. And over on your right are examples of the characteristic points from this period. The Neville points are the 2 rows above straight-stemmed, medium-bladed points, and the Stark points are more narrow-stemmed and have these converging bases. And a lot of these point styles are, using local materials, locally available materials, quartz, quartzite, shales. Although there of course is evidence of trade in some of these being exotic toolstone. Next slide, please. Late Archaic, 6,000 years ago to 3,800 years ago. This is a fluorescence of the hunter-gatherer way of life here. It's the warming continues till about 5,000 BP, and then we're into modern climatic conditions. They're very stable conditions. It's very conducive to an explosive population, human population. Not only in explosive increase in sites, but also in the artifacts and the cultural features that we find on the sites, and of course, human population, not to mention plant populations and animal populations, all of which are doing extremely well. There's a great abundance at this point in time. And the importance of fishing first shows up during the late Archaic. At least this is because we find fishing equipment, artifacts that are part of fishing equipment during the late Archaic. They're definitely dated to the late Archaic. This is not to say that they weren't fishing earlier. They likely were. I know that in New York, there is definitely evidence of fishing and shell fishing at New York sites, Eastern New York sites during the Middle Archaic and possibly even the early Archaic. We don't have that evidence here yet, but that doesn't mean that it isn't here. No evidence doesn't mean evidence of no activity. Just means we haven't found it yet. So, so you have a booming broad spectrum economy. Broad spectrum means that they are collecting and hunting and fishing a great variety of plants and animals for food sources and other staples. And at this point, we do believe that these large settlements represent band societies, which are made up of kin groups, related individuals. We also have evidence of indigenous spirituality at this time period. And again, this does not mean that there was no spirituality during earlier periods. It means that we just haven't found any material evidence for it. There obviously was. Spirituality is one of the earliest and most pervasive of characteristics of human groups. So there obviously was, we just haven't found the material evidence for it yet, but we do in the late Archaic. We also, this is the first evidence where we can actually date personal ornamentation to this time frame. Ornaments such as stone pennants, stone and other materials made for beads and things like that. Again, this doesn't mean that they weren't in earlier societies. We just don't have the material evidence and the radiocarbon dates for them from those societies. Again, there are two artifact traditions, and they are thought to represent two separate populations. Okay, and on the right there, that is just one example of an annual subsistence round. That is actually from my book on Connecticut's indigenous peoples. And it shows the subsistence round for late Archaic communities in Connecticut. And the outside shows what major plants and animals were collected during each of the 4 seasons. They do by no means show you all the plants and animals that were collected during each season. If you looked at my book, you'd see that there are dozens of plants and animals for each of those seasons that we just couldn't fit it into that image. And in the interior, those animals basically represent year-round food sources. So, next slide. Okay, the Laurentian is the Laurentian artifact tradition represents Laurentian communities on the landscape. These settlements are found in the major river valleys. They're focusing on the major river valleys, and they have rather narrow spectrum economies. They're not as broad as the other artifact tradition and communities, which are called narrow point communities. And on your right are photographs of the characteristics, spear points from Laurentian sites. The upper one is called, that particular style is called Otter Creek, and they're medium bladed. The lower one are Brewerton. I think those are all Brewerton side notched points, but there is a Brewerton series. Again, these are medium bladed, rather thin points, often made from exotic tool stone. There is also a groundstone technology among Laurentian communities that indicate groundstone axes and adzes and indicating woodworking activities and relatively elaborate burial ritual. Next slide, please. And these are some more of the Laurentian technology here, representative. Over in the upper right, you can see the groundstone tools. On the left, those are adzes. In the center, they're axes. These are all axe heads, adze heads. And on the right are gouges. Groundstone, most of them are made from, if not all of them, are made from basalts. And the lower right, one of our primitive technologists at the museum hafted some of those groundstone tools. Those are regular Middle Archaic artifacts, but they've been hafted on contemporary wood, but hafted in the native way. They're done with sinew and animal hoof glue. And up in the upper left is evidence of fish processing. That is a semi-lunar knife that's called an ulu. And it's called an ulu by native peoples in Canada and Alaska, the Inuit peoples, also known as Eskimo. And it's a woman knife for processing fish and sea mammals such as seals. But they are found here in southern New England in Laurentian context. And it's a groundstone tool. It's also groundstone technology. These are still being used by women and probably men up in Alaska and Canada, but now they're made out of stainless steel up there. And that lower center photograph shows a number of different stone net sinkers and line sinkers, also obviously evidence of fishing. We have also found stone fish weirs. The lower left-hand painting, both of those paintings are by David Wagner, a very esteemed historic artist who's done a lot of paintings, historic paintings of Native people in Connecticut. And the one in the lower right actually shows right there in the extreme left, you can see the evidence of a stone fish weir. And that actually exists. That is a fish weir that's located along the Quinnebog River in Killingly, Connecticut, Danielson. I actually directed excavations at that fish weir, and there are a number of small loci that suggest family fishing there at that weir. And the weir actually dates from at least the late Archaic period right up into the late Woodland period. Okay, next slide. Laurentian burial ritual. And a good example of that is the Bliss Cemetery site in Old Lyme. It was excavated by Dr. John Pfeiffer, and this photograph is one of his, courtesy of John. At this particular site, there were 21 cremation burials with radiocarbon dates from 4775 to 4545 years ago. These particular cremation burials were covered with red ochre powder and ground mica. Red ochre is thought by some of the northern New England indigenous peoples to actually protect mourners from the great spiritual forces that occurred during these cremations. And of course, ground mica, it's shiny, it's white, and it's known that traditionally quartz, white, translucent, shiny objects such as quartz crystal, shell, mica, pyrites, iron pyrites. These are very spiritual. They bring spiritual forces to you. They are attracted, deities are attracted to them, and that if you keep them in your home, that you will experience well-being and spiritual protection. And if you put them in the graves, of course, both the mourners and the dead are equally protected. And red ochre is known by Native people to symbolize blood and eternal life. A number of the grave goods, there were a number of artifacts, there were food remains, and there were, of course, quartz crystals and iron pyrites in these grave goods, and also the bones of Canis. It was either from dog, it was either dog or wolf skeletal material. They couldn't differentiate. All of those were found in the grave goods, and the artifacts were burned and ritually killed. And if you look at the photograph on the right, you'll see how that large pestle was broken in a number of pieces purposely, as were a number of these other artifacts, and they were actually pieced together and glued together by John's laboratory crew. But they had been broken, and that was to release their spirits, the spirit of the artifact, so that the spirits of the artifacts could follow the soul of the individual that they were buried with to the creator's homeland, which was thought by Native peoples in New England to be located in the southwestern heavens. And it was thought that after they died, people, their souls would be doing the same things that they did when they were living, only that everything would be nice and happy, there would be no disease, things like that. So the artifacts were put into the graves, these grave goods, to help the soul on his way to the creator's house, and also to have these tools and food when he was at the creator's house. Also, back, just one more thing. In these cremations, John found both dry bone and green bone. Now, dry bone is when you allow the corpse to dry out, become skeletalized, and then you cremate it. Green bone is when you're taking body parts and putting them in the crematory. Now, he explained this by referring to a number of ethnographic accounts of burials, informant interviews with Native people, and also Europeans actually being there to view some of these burial activities. And in this case, John described what one of the French Jesuit priests described in Canada, where he witnessed a Huron burial. And the dry bones, of course, are regular, are the deceased, but the green bones were not part of the deceased skeletal remains. These are the Jesuit priests described seeing mourners cut off a digital, like a finger or a toe, and throw it in to the burial to show their great mourning, their great feelings for the loss of the individual. And a lot of these of this grave goods and the use of red ochre and other things, these are actually described in these early ethnographic accounts if you do enough research to find them. Okay, next. Now, narrow point communities. These communities, these are an extension of the, well, no, let me just go into this, what I've got written here, otherwise we'll be here all night. These are very adaptable communities, these societies, these narrow point societies. Their settlements are found in a variety of environments, in microenvironments. They're found in small and large river valleys. They're found along the seacoast. They're found in the uplands. They're found along inland wetlands. They're even found in fairly dry upland areas. It seems that they could adapt anywhere. And this is why you will see that these narrow point communities extend from the late Archaic period all the way up into late Woodland period. And in fact, Dr. Lorraine Williams, who excavated Fort Shantok, which is a 17th century, 18th century Mohegan palisaded fort and village, she claims that she found narrow stemmed points in the living areas of this 17th century site. So they continue for a long period, and probably they're very broad spectrum economies. They're collecting and eating just about everything. Their main characteristic tool is the narrow stem point, which are small, narrow, bladed, thick spear and atlatl points, mostly made of local toolstone, quartz and quartzite. And they also had small triangles that were associated with these points as well. And they had relatively simple burial rituals. Next. Okay, into the terminal Archaic, 3,800 through 27 years ago. Again, there is environmental stress here, which probably brought about a lot of elaborate ritual, at least at the part of the terminal Archaic population. There is a modern climate, but there's several oscillations in temperature and in the amount of rainfall. For example, there is what is known as the Little Ice Age around 3,300 years ago, where it becomes quite cool. And at that point also, because of the cool conditions, that the polar ice caps, the melting slows down, and that slows down the rise in sea level. And this actually helps in the development of salt marshes along the coast and at the mouth of river valleys. And this is a very important thing because marshes are veritable food factories for native populations, and we'll get to that later on. But there are two artifact traditions during this period. And one is called the Narrow Point, again, our Narrow Point tradition, and the other one is called the Broad Spear or Susquehanna. However, there is no consensus that these actually represent two different cultural populations. There are some people who believe that these broad spear points were actually used by the same population that made the narrow points, but they were a different function. Some people believe that they were used for spear fishing or for fish processing, as opposed to the narrow points being used in various hunting activities. Although you'll notice that the narrow points, a lot of them are actually knives. So also during this period, there is a soapstone technology where soapstone bowls are being made, and the first appearance of clay cooking pots, although they're very rare, and they seem to be a minor element in the technology. Probably because the soapstone bowls were being used for what cooking pots are later used as. Basically, all of these clay pots in the Woodland period seem to be used for cooking purposes. And over here on the right, that is a stone bowl, obviously, at the top. And I can't remember where that came from. I know it's from my book, but I can't remember who sent it to me. We may have taken it, actually. It might even be from the collections at the Institute. We have a lot of stone bowls there. But the lower one is actually a photograph from Dr. Ken Fader, who excavated a soapstone quarry, soapstone bowl making quarry in the Barkhamsted area. And you can see those lumps on the top. That is actually a soapstone bedrock, and those lumps on the top are soapstone bowls in the making. It's the bottom of the bowls, and then for some reason they never finished taking them off. But what they would do next is they would cut into the base and then turn them over and hollow them out with specific scrapers for that use. Okay, next. Now, broad spear communities. These are, we find them and mainly in riverine areas, large river areas. Again, they're using broad bladed artifacts, and you can see them right here on the right. Those are three large spear points from the Rye Hill site in Woodbury. And you'll notice that they're all broken and put together mainly because they came out of cremation burials at Rye Hill, and they definitely were in the crematory and purposely killed. And on the, let's see, what are the other sites here? A lot of this is exotic toolstone from mid-Atlantic sources. We get argillites from New Jersey area. We get jaspers and from the Delaware River Valley, the eastern Pennsylvania. We get rhyolites from Maryland. Let's see, what else do we get? And they also have groundstone technologies, and you can see that in the lower photograph. Of course, my bottom is cut off, and I think that's from the miner site in New Haven, but I can't see that. And again, that's another cremation burial, and you can see how the pestles and some of the other artifacts have been purposely killed to release their spirits. But there is a groundstone axe on the right-hand side in there. And then, of course, the pestles are also ground stone. And the lower left, as I recall, those are, I don't know, Tina, does it say it there? Does that say that it's from the Farmington River Valley?
Yes,
Like-
it says Farmington Valley sites.
That's what I thought. And those are a number of broad-bladed points. This is called, the one on the left is actually called a boat stone point because it's shaped like a boat. So they have, this broad spear sites have very narrow spectrum economy with white-tailed deer, nuts and acorns, and seedy plants like Chenopodium and amaranth are found there. And of course, elaborate burial ritual. Now, John Pfeiffer, who has excavated a number of these broad spear points, believes that they are actually a separate population. And he believes that they are based in the riverine valleys. And what's happening is that during this period, because of the rise in sea level, even though it's still rising, even though it's not rising as fast as it was in earlier cultural periods, that they're losing their environment. And for this reason, that's why you're seeing such elaborate burial ritual, because they're being stressed out. Okay, next, yes. All right, early woodland, 2,700 through 1650 years ago. And what you see here is you see cultural continuity reflects narrow point communities. They continue on just as they did in the earlier late Archaic and terminal Archaic periods. But you also have the onset of a little ice age going here, a cooler period during this time period. And there is a major decline in settlements and population here. You see the disappearance of the broad spear population. But you still see smaller sites and not as many sites as you saw during the terminal Archaic period. The marshlands continue to develop and expand, and the narrow point communities take full advantage of these things. Soapstone bowls disappear, but clay pots become more common. And the reason for this, there's several ideas for this. First of all, because you're getting this cool period, a lot of your warmth-loving nut trees and acorns, oaks and hickories are probably, you're not seeing as many as you did during the terminal Archaic period, and therefore you're not seeing as many nuts and acorns. And this may be a reason for the broad spear population who are so dependent on these food sources. Also, the clay pots, because the marshlands are expanding, you're getting a ton of vegetation. One marshland produces tons of vegetation a year. I mean tons. There was one in Niantic that I remember reading about that produced something like 88 tons of vegetation a year. And also with these, in these marshland type of vitamins, a lot of these have seedy plants or tubers that if you're not drying the tubers and pounding them into meal, they need long-term slow cooking. And clay pots are ideal for this. They're like your present-day crock pots. You'd be able to put them over a fire and have them slow cook during the day on both of those. And so they become more and more common, probably because they're very functional for these type of foods. You continue to see long distance trade and of course, burial and long distance trade, especially, we're seeing them coming out of the long distance out of the west and maybe the mid-Atlantic too, because that's probably a route to the west as well as just going through New York State. But we start seeing a number of New York artifacts. For example, in the upper photograph on the left there, those are meadowwood points made out of Onondaga chert, which is a Western, this particular Onondaga chert is very typical Western New York. It's a very, it's a modeled medium light gray and tan type of chert. Easy to recognize, but especially if you do thin sectioning or other type of geological techniques on it. But anyway, we're finding these in early woodland contexts here in Connecticut. And we also find on the right, those are Adena Points, which are very reminiscent of Ohio and other Midwestern points from the Adena period in the Midwest. The lower photograph is, these are artifacts that were found at the Hollister site in Glastonbury, which is thought to be an Adena site. And you have the blocked end tube pipe, which is found in Adena sites in the Midwest. And you also find these so-called groundstone balls and spheres. Again, these are found in Midwestern burial mounds. Next. Okay, the lower left, you see that's a cache. That is from a cache of, what is it? I can't see the caption on that, but I think it's 139. There's 26 cache blades. They are made out of Onondaga chert from Western New York. And that was found in a cache, an underground cache, buried and stored in Windsor. And that was what, 139? I think it must say that on there. Now, whatever it is, it's coming. And we find several of these types of cache throughout Connecticut. There's a number of them that have been found from this time period, made out of Onondaga chert. And these particular cache blades are easily chipped down into meadowwood points. Another Midwestern artifact is this platform pipe, which you see in the lower center there. And also Midwestern are all of these objects on the right. First of all, the lower right, you can see a ground and polished birdstone. And it's called birdstone because it looks like a seated bird with a Popeye and a beak, and it's seated there. And we don't know what they're used for. They're mostly made out of banded slate that comes from Ohio and Western Pennsylvania. They're probably being brought in as is and not being manufactured here at all. They're found in a lot of ceremonial and ritual contexts among what are known as the Mound Builders, Mound Builder culture, which is Hopewellian, Adena cultures from the Midwest. And they do have, you can't see it on this, but there are holes in the bottom. So it's meant to be attached to something, but who knows what. And also the top are known as boat stones. And again, it's made from, I think that one is made from fire clay from Ohio. And again, you can see the holes on the base of these. So whether these are just being brought in by traders from the Midwest, or whether they are being brought in maybe from Connecticut traders who have gone out there and come in, or if they're coming down the line and it's just an artifact that gives leaders here in Connecticut status, or whether it's actually coming in with a whole cult, some type of burial cult, some type of spiritual package. We don't know, but there's definitely trade networks, exchange systems with these Adena mound builder communities there. And as I told Tina and Terry, I gave a talk on the Farmington Valley and the archaeology of the Farmington Valley several years ago to, I think it was the Barkhamsted Historical Society. And I couldn't understand why all of these exotic artifacts were coming in the Farmington Valley, because frankly, I'm originally from Shelton and along the coast there. And I've always thought of the Farmington Valley as being the boondocks, contemporarily speaking. And so I couldn't figure out why they were coming in here. And so I finally looked at a map of the Greater Valley, and I noticed that the Farmington River Valley, with a small portage, it actually connects you to the Housatonic River, and then you just go a little north and a little portage takes you over to the Hoosick River, which is a major artery of the Hudson Valley. You get into the Hudson River and you just go a little ways south and you hit the mouth of the Mohawk River Valley. And the Mohawk is the conduit into the Midwest. And so that's where a lot of these artifacts are coming and a lot of the ideas. Not necessarily everything coming along the coast, as I erroneously thought, being a coastal person. Okay, next slide. Now, the Middle Woodland period, 1650 to 950 years ago, and you find a lot of cultural stability. There's also climatic stability at this time, and very good climatic conditions for continued development and expansion of the marshlands, and continued abundance of plants and animals and the entire physical environment. And this leads to the creation of large multi-seasonal settlements, especially along the rivers and the coast. Probably the beginning of village life here, and also tribal territories. There are increased amounts and diversity of artifacts, of dietary remains, and cultural features. So there's and these all indicate population growth and communal prosperity. There's also international trade networks. And again, there's a focus on the mid-Atlantic. A lot of the artifacts are made out of mid-Atlantic stone sources. For example, up there on the right, Fox Creek are typical early middle woodland spear points, and your Jack's Reef points on the right there's Jack's Reef corner knots and Jack's Reef pentagonal. These are typical late middle woodland, and many of them are made from exotic tool stone. In fact, you can see those white specks in the Fox Creek point there, which suggests that it's probably rhyolite from Maryland, but there's also rhyolites. There's also argillites coming in from New Jersey and the Mid-Atlantic region. Most of the Jack's Reef point types are made from highly valuable cryptocrystalline siliceous materials, which are very hard, easily chipped, and make great points and sharp edges. These are basically flints, cherts, jaspers coming in, again, probably from the mid-Atlantic area. In fact, most of them are jaspers. In Connecticut, most of that type point is made from jaspers, and geological analysis done by them, one by the late Barbara Ludke, who was an archaeologist at University of Massachusetts in Boston, and a specialist on lithic sourcing, showed that they were mostly from Eastern Pennsylvania. Also, this is when the bow and arrow makes its appearance in New England, and it is thought that the Jack's Reef points are the first arrow points in the area, probably around AD 600. So let's see, what else do we have here? Okay, next slide. Late Woodland period, 950 years ago through 497 years ago. And again, that is AD 1524 when Verrazano shows up as the first documented European visitor to the area. Late Woodland period, there is a great deal of social and economic prosperity. There's the onset of the little climatic warming period, which continues into, I think, the 14th century AD. And areas are warmer, seem to be warmer than they were than they are today. Certain southern plant species show up in archaeological sites. Black walnut, sourwood are some of them, indicating that the weather is warmer, the summers are warmer than they are today. This is the introduction of horticulture occurs here in the, at least the maize, squash, beans syndrome. There are expanding stone technology, and we also, by the way, find a lot of tools made out of perishable materials, bone and antler. They were probably made in earlier cultural periods, but because our New England soils are so acidic that they were destroyed, whereas in the late Woodland period, which is much later, they're intact. Also, we find a lot of shell middens in the late Woodland period where they're doing a lot of shell fishing. And of course, shells are calcium carbonate, sweetens the soil, protects the artifacts. There's an intensification of trade routes. They're using a lot of them. They're going to a lot of different places. There's continued population growth. Definitely tribal territories by this time. We can actually see it in the clay pots, because there are different styles that are marking off different geographic regions. And this is just the golden age of Native American village life at this point, which probably would have continued except in the final Woodland period. This is when we start really having European visitation, and then a lot of this collapses. The upper right, those are Lavana style arrow points, which are characteristic of this period. And as you can see, they're all different kind of colors, and they represent different exotic tool stone. The brownish colors are, of course, jasper, coming from the mid-Atlantic. There are the blacks and grays, our church sources, and also the blues coming from, a lot coming from New York State. And there are also felsites and rhyolites that are coming from northern New England and the Boston Basin. And even some of these are made out of quartz, which are local. The lower photograph is of part of our replicated village at the Institute for American Indian Studies. And it's just supposed to represent a typical Algonquian late woodland village at the time. You can see that there are wigwams or weetus, as that they're called in southern New England, covered with bark. Along the coast, they would have been covered with grasses. There is a larger house that was probably the sachem's house, because the sachem would host people who came in and during bad weather, a lot of the ceremonies would be held in his house. And of course, you can see the dugout canoe. Dugout canoes were used in this area. A lot of the woodworking tools that you saw were not only used to clear areas for camps, but also to make the dugout canoe. And there's one sitting right there in the center of the photo. Okay, and this was probably, at this point in time, these large populations, and some of these villages probably were year-round, used year-round. They, all 4 seasons, although it's very difficult to tell have evidence for winter season, but they probably were. And these are probably evidence of chiefdoms type of social organization in this area. Next. Okay. I just want to talk a little bit about this late woodland society. By this time, Native people, and probably even earlier, had an intense knowledge of their physical environments. So much so that they were really our first scientists, our first environmental stewards. And I'm just going to go quickly through this. Our first herbalist, and this is an example right here on the far right. Eunice Maui was a culture keeper and an herbalist, herbal doctor for the Schaghticoke tribe. She lived to be 104 years old, and many people would come to her for, as they did to her grandfather, who was the sachem of the tribe, Gideon Maui. That was his Christian name. Before that, he was Mauihu, and he was a well-known Native religious practitioner who could cure snake bite, among other things, and a lot of the local whites went to him. One guy even went to him, and we know this because of there was a Moravian mission at Schaghticoke in the 1700s, and the Moravians kept diaries, everyday diaries, and wrote all kinds of letters, and there's wonderful documentation. It gives you this great window into Schaghticoke life during the mid-1700s. And of course, the Moravians wrote about this, and they talked about how Gideon also helped to cure other ills as well, including arthritis, because obviously the local Euro-American doctors didn't know how to do that. And Gideon actually told the fellow to build a sweat lodge and use it regularly. And of course, we know that steam baths are very good for joint pain. So, okay, let's go on. Next slide. Okay, they were also America's first zoologists and botanists because they knew so much. Of course, the subsistence round that I showed you before, they knew exactly where all these plants and animals were located. They knew when the plants were, the tubers or the seeds or the berries, when they would be ripe and when to collect them. And the same thing with a lot of these animals, they knew where their dens were. They knew animal behavior. Even later on, when the Europeans were here, they acted as guides for European hunters, and they actually told them the best ways to hunt. For example, turkeys. The Dutch complained that the turkeys would fly away before they could hunt them. And so the natives told them how to do that. And over here on the right, this is a picture of excavations at the Morgan site, which was located in the floodplain of the Connecticut River at Rocky Hill. I co-directed that site for like 5 years. It was a major late woodland site of the Wango community, dated from about 1100 AD to 1360. And this is apparently, that's around the onset of when that little ice age comes in. So they probably left the site because they could no longer, it was a major horticultural site with farm fields there. And possibly it was getting too cold to actually grow corn, and that might be why they left the site. But that particular site, there was something like a 30 by 50 foot excavation there. And that's what you're seeing there. And we went down about 6 feet because, of course, the river inundated the area. So it was all woodland, but still about 5 or 6 feet of cultural levels. And just in that 30 by 60 feet, we found evidence for 10 animal species and 35 different plant species that they were collecting. Next. First, astronomers. We know from Roger Williams. Roger Williams was an English, a Puritan leader who was first in Massachusetts Bay Colony, didn't want to be there, left, actually founded Providence, Rhode Island, and lived for many years among the Narragansett people in that area. And he actually wrote a book about them, A Key into the Language of America, where he talks about the Algonquian language, but he also is giving you a great window into Southern New England Native American cultures. And he wrote that in 1643, and it's been published even in the 20th century. You can still find this book. And he talks about how everybody knew all about the heavenly bodies, even the children, what the names were and their movements. And here's the quote from there. And then they point with the hand to the sun, by whose height they keep account of the day, and by the moon and stars by night, as we does by clocks and dials. In other words, they could tell time at night by the movement of the stars and moon, and during the day by the movement of the sun, just as the English were able to tell time by the clock. Native people also used heavenly bodies as calendars for important tribal ceremonies. And you can actually find a number of their stone ceremonial sites are still found within the Connecticut landscape, especially in uplands areas on the sides of hillsides, so they could view the horizon and tell when the ceremony should begin and end. And Native ceremonies didn't last like 1 or 2 days like our ceremonies do. They lasted 9, 10, 11 days. And we know that they started when certain celestial bodies were in a certain position, and they ended when certain celestial bodies were in a certain position. We know this because Frank Speck, who was a well-known cultural anthropologist who studied many of the tribes in the Midwest and Northeast during the early and mid 1900s, actually viewed some of these ceremonies. He participated, well, he didn't participate in them, but he watched them ongoing and wrote quite a bit about them and published. And on the right is a photo. I think that photo, I don't know who took that photo, but I think it was Curtis Hoffman, Dr. Curtis Hoffman from Bridgewater University. And it shows part of one of these stone ceremonial sites in Killingworth, Connecticut. And if you look in the background, you can see some more stone cultural features there. But the main one we're looking at here is a turtle effigy. And his head points to the winter solstice. It's the sunrise, I think. I can't read the caption on it. But anyway, many of these stone ceremonial features are aligned to certain solar and lunar events, as well as to some constellations like the Pleiades or the Big Dipper, which had a great deal of symbolic meaning for them in their belief system. Next. Also, the first geologists, as I said, they had a vast knowledge of the rock formations, not only in their tribal areas, but in other people's tribal areas as well. And they knew what types of rock were best used for what stone tool types. For example, cutting and piercing. A lot of that is cryptocrystalline silica, jaspers, cherts, quartzes too. Groundstone tools were best made from heavy metamorphic basalts and things like that. They knew what types would make the best tools. They knew where these were located, and they knew how best to work them into stone tools. And as I said, they also knew where they were located in other regions and were able to trade for them. And this is part of an exhibit at the Institute for American Indian Studies. And I just put it in here so you could see just from the colors, you could tell that there was a variety of tool types that they did use and make use of. And most of them are, most of the ones that you see here are non-Connecticut, they're exotic. The only ones in here that aren't there's a couple of quartzite and quartz points, which are local, but everything else is non-local. Next. And they were our first American environmental stewards because they did actively manage their physical environments. When the first Europeans came over, they wrote back about this being a howling wilderness. And yet they also wrote back that there were beautiful park-like areas with just a few trees and no underbrush. Well, you know, it can't be both. And it wasn't. Basically, Native people were controlling the environment. One of the major ways they did that was from controlled burning. And there are a number of English and Dutchmen who write about this in the 16 and 1700s, seeing the Indians do these controlled burns. And this quote is from Adrian van der Donck, who was a Dutch colonist of New Netherland. He lived in Albany, and he also lived down in New Amsterdam as well. And he wrote a book in 1650, and he says in there, the Indians have a yearly custom of burning the woods, plains, and meadows in the fall of the year when the leaves have fallen and when the grass and vegetable substances are dry, to thin out and clear the woods of all dead substances and grass which grow better the ensuing spring. There's a whole bunch of reasons why they did control burning. It wasn't only to clear out all the dead wood because that would make less spontaneous forest fires, and they would grow better. And it was a lot of the edge environments. There would be more edge environments, and edge environments are preferred by major staples, white-tailed deer, turkeys. Also, a lot of berry plants grow in disturbed soils like that when you do these burns, and so do seedy plants like chenopode. So it increases a lot of their plant and animal staples. They also cleared it so you could see better and farther, and you could walk through it easier. Oh, again, next slide. Final woodland period. This is basically from when Verrazano first appears on the landscape to the first settlements in Connecticut. And basically, it's a continuation of late woodland lifestyles by the Indian communities. And they're introduced to European trade goods, many of which improve indigenous lifeways. For example, metal products, also bolts of cloth, because all of their clothing was made from animal skins, which is very difficult to clean. It's heavy in winter, attracts lice, so they like the European cloth. But also with these trade goods, the Europeans brought along diseases, which greatly reduced populations. As soon as Windsor and the House of Hope were settled, a huge epidemic went through the Indian communities. What the English called the plague. We don't know whether it was a plague or not. And right after that, smallpox came through, and whole communities were destroyed. The English are writing about some of these communities. Everybody's dead. In fact, everybody's dead and dying. There isn't anybody there to bury the dead. And it's been estimated that from 77 to 90% of the Native American population in New England was gone by 1650, mostly through diseases, but also through warfare and other alcoholism, which was introduced by the Europeans as well, so they could make a better deal. And what this leaves you with are crippled societies. So when the settlement period, European settlement period started, they're already being introduced to Native societies that are vastly crippled. Think about if this COVID disease had taken over and we didn't have the vaccination and it just hit our Connecticut, and 77 to 90% of our population died. It's not only that the population has gone, it's that the leaders in your population have gone. Your religious leaders, your military, your government leaders, your herbal practitioners, your culture keepers, they're all gone. What do? And what if some other country comes over and wants to take over? For example, say Russia comes in after we've done this. That's a real problem. And that's what they actually had. And next slide, please. And that is why Native people were in such disarray by the end of the 1600s. In the it's in the early 1600s. It's been estimated that there were at least 18 separate tribes in Connecticut. One of those was the Tungsten Tribe, who had a vast homeland in the Farmington Valley, going from what's present-day Farmington all the way over to Waterbury and all the way up practically to the Massachusetts border. Huge homelands. And English writings on them talk about how there were a great many Indians in the Farmington area, and the English settlers were actually afraid because they were so outnumbered. But of course, great land losses, and a lot of these land losses are caused because they don't know that they're selling land. Native people had no idea about single proprietorship. With Native societies, their homelands are given to them by the Creator, and that they use those homelands as a community, as a group. The sachem, the leader, people later call him the chief, would assign certain areas to certain lineages. But there was no single family, no single person that owned this land. They had no idea of own ownership. They had an idea of allowing people to use their land temporarily. For example, a lot of the inland groups would come down to the shore during the late summer and early fall to collect fish and shellfish and dry them and smoke them and bring them back to their community to use during the so-called starvation period during late winter and early spring. And when they came down, of course, the coastland as it is today was heavily populated by other Native people. So they would give some kind of tribute to them, deer skins, acorns, whatever they would bring. And a lot of this so-called gift giving, a lot of it doesn't matter what the gift is. It's the fact that you're giving it and you're making a connection here, an alliance. And this is probably what they thought they were doing when the Europeans came and wanted land. And that's why you see huge amounts of land being sold for nothing. For example, huge tracts in Southbury, Connecticut, around Kettletown area where the lake is. All of that was sold for one kettle. Now, that's why it's called Kettletown. Now, do you really think the Indians, please, if don't have that mentality of childlike, primitive, didn't know what they were doing, wanted one pot, so they sold like hundreds of acres of land, thousands of acres for one kettle? I don't think so. They were doing it as a form of tribute. They had no idea that this meant that they lost their land and had to get out. Of course, they realize this when the English move in, because they don't always move in at right away. But when they move in and tell them they got to leave, then they understand. And then you see the later deeds have these notations in them that say, okay, we're selling you this land, but they're asking a lot more for it. But they're also saying, but we also have the right to hunt and fish in these areas, to collect basket wood from them, blah, blah, blah. You can actually see these in the deeds. Of course, the English ignore most of those and they're forced out. And so there's huge land losses. And of course, this causes poverty, it causes debt, and it's a potential erosion of their tribal identity, because as Aurelius Piper, who was Chief Big Eagle, who was a great chief of the Paugussets for many, many years, lived to be in his 90s and only died a few years ago. As he said, the land is the culture, speaking about Native cultures. So anyway, with the Tunguses, this is exactly what happened with the Tungsten, and they decided to join, to leave the area, and the leadership decided that they would leave the area, and they were going to join the Brothertown movement, which was a Christian Indian movement started by the Reverend Samson Occam, who's pictured here, the Mohegan leader, and his son-in-law, Joseph Johnson, because Occam decided that the only way that Native peoples can thrive and live on is to be separate from white people. He was a Christian minister. And if you read, and you can go online and read some of his treaties and stuff, and you would think you were reading a very intelligent white guy's writings, but it's Samson Occam, who was a full-blooded Mohegan leader. Anyway, so they and many other Native groups in Southern New England join this movement, this Brothertown movement. For example, the Niantic Indians from southeastern Connecticut feel the same way as the Tungsten. And this is mainly a survival strategy for some Native peoples who are losing their homelands, afraid of losing their tribal identity, but they want to keep their Indian identity. So they join this pan-Indian movement and move. What the Brothertown movement does, move to Western New York. They're given land there by, who gives them land? The Oneida. And they actually have a thriving Indian town there with their own school, their own church, their own government, mill sites, doing really well until, of course, the whites force them out, and they're pushed and pushed until they end up in Wisconsin. And they are now called the Brotherton Indian Nation. And I've got a photo of them at one of their 211 powwow there, where they are state recognized. Let's see. As of today, the Connecticut government only recognizes 6 tribes. The Schaghticoke, well, the Schaghticoke are divided into 2 tribes now. Schaghticoke Tribal Nation, Schaghticoke Indian Tribe, the Mohegan, the Mashantucket Pequot, the Eastern Pequot, and the Golden Hill Pagusset. But there are other tribes living in Connecticut that are not recognized by the government. There's the Nipmuc Nation in northeastern Connecticut. There's the Quinnipiac in the Branford, New Haven area. There are others, and there are also a lot of tribal people living in Connecticut who belong to tribes that are outside of Connecticut. Okay, next tribe. Next slide. I think I'm almost through. Yes, this is the last slide, and I put this in because there are some people who think that reading about Native American history and Native American cultures is irrelevant because it has nothing to do with our present American culture. I actually saw an email that someone had sent in on my book saying, basically, why should I read about Native American cultures when they contributed nothing to my American culture? Well, that is wrong completely because they have contributed a lot. And this last slide just gives you a synopsis of what Native American communities have contributed. First of all, over 90% of our present day American food culture was provided by Native Americans. Not only your maize, bean, squash culture, and up in the upper right-hand corner, that is popcorn. Native people also introduced popcorn to us. That popcorn was actually grown from seeds, 8,000-year-old seeds that were found in a cave in southwestern New Mexico. But 90% of the foods we have, potatoes, They aren't Irish, believe me. The first potatoes are from the Americas. Tomatoes, same thing, not Italian. Those are derived from native peoples in the Americas. There's also, let's see, what else is there? There's chocolate, there's coffee, there's a whole bunch of things that I can't think of right now because I want to get out of here. So, but 90% of our present food culture was provided by Native Americans. Our American communication systems, virtually all of our major highways in Connecticut were originally Native American trails, as were our railroad tracks, our railroad system. And this is true for the entire continent. Political system. Native American cultures were our first American democracies. They may be the first democracies in the world, I'm not sure, but I certainly know that they were the first democracies in America. When Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin and James Madison were writing our Bill of Rights and Constitution, they actually visited with Native American leaders, especially the Iroquois, and subsequently, our Bill of Rights and our Constitution are based in part on Native American political organization. Many American statesmen are Native peoples. In fact, we even had a vice president of the United States who was Native American, Charles Curtis, who was he was Kaw Nation, and I think also Potawatomi, and from Kansas. He was a lawyer, and then he was a congressman from Kansas, and he became vice president under Herbert Hoover. American music, literature, the arts. There are a number of indigenous musicians, writers, and artists that helped shape our American genres into their present forms. And one example, of course, is rock and roll. Many of the musicians who wrote rock and roll and who performed it were Native Americans. Prime examples, of course, are Elvis Presley, whose great-great-great-grandmother's name was, I think it was White Mourning Dove, something like that. Jimi Hendrix was 1/4 Cherokee, and there are many others as well. American, and of course, there's a lot of Native American actors and writers as well that I don't want to go into, because if you want to ask me questions, I better get out of here. Science, American science and health. A lot of indigenous scientists, herbal doctors, which we've already gone through, create advanced technologies and medical practices. One of the scientists I have right up there is John Harrington, who's of the Chickasaw Nation. That photo of him, he's an aeronautical engineer and one of the NASA astronauts. You can even go back further and say a lot of the basic tenets of Native American belief, the idea that everything is interrelated and that it is very necessary to keep balance in the natural world. These are tenets of our Western science today. Our general systems theory, our quantum physics, and even Linnaeus's classification of the plant and animal worlds are all based on those tenets. American sports, there's tons of sports people and sports stars even today. And protection of American freedoms. Native American veterans fought in every one of our wars for American freedom, from the French and Indian Wars all the way up to today's Near Eastern wars. And the 2010 census shows that a good portion of Indigenous people are vets, much more. That 2.9 is more than our general population. And that's it, folks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lucy, for a very, very thorough presentation. I did monitor the questions as we went through, and in all honesty, your slides have the timelines and the pictures that were where most people's questions were. The questions that we have on sort of food and cultural things we're going to address probably in later elements of our series, as we are planning more workshops for next year, more workshops and presentations. And so what I'm going to do to consolidate time is everyone will receive who's registered the recording tomorrow. We will also send out links to your book, links to the Institute. We will send out links for the upcoming programs, and we will cover everything in that way so that everyone can move on with their evening. But everything you said was thorough and fascinating. Thank you for being part of our series, and I hope everyone has a good night. Thank you.
And Tina, can I say one thing?
Yes, go ahead.
If anybody wants to email me directly on questions on this, they can email me at the Institute for American Indian Studies. It's my name, lavin@iaismuseum.org.
Wonderful. And I'll also put that in the email tomorrow. All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for attending and joining us, and we'll see you again next month. Good night.